Hey, this is Mr. Janes. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to find missing angle measures and segment lengths in diagrams, given some information. But before we can do that, we need to learn some basic vocabulary terms for angles and segments. So, please take out the Naming Geometric Figures 2 vocabulary sheet that we started the other day, and go down to the second half. We did the first part, but we haven't talked about the second part, labeled pairs of angles. If you don't have this, please take out a lined piece of paper so you can take notes on this. But before we get started, I'd like you to pause and predict what these vocabulary terms might be by reading the definitions and filling in the blanks with any of the vocabulary terms that you actually already know. Go ahead and pause the video now and fill in whatever words you might already know. Alright, now that you've done that, let's go ahead and learn some vocabulary terms that you might not know yet. First up, two angles that share a side or have a common ray. Those will be called adjacent angles. ADJ, ACENT, adjacent angles. So here is a figure, or an example, of adjacent angles. So we have one angle here in green, and one angle here in blue. These two angles will be considered adjacent because when we look at the sides of these angles, the rays, they share this ray right here that I'm putting in yellow. Both the blue angle and the green angle have this ray in common. So that would be considered an adjacent, or a pair of adjacent angles. On the other hand, if I have one angle here and another angle over here, these are not adjacent angles because they do not share any of the same sides, the same rays. Notice that this green angle has its own rays, and this blue angle also has its own rays. So this is not a pair of adjacent angles. Now here's one last example that's a little bit confusing. Imagine you've got one angle here and another angle here, and I'll label the first one in green and the second one in blue just like I did before. Now you might say these angles are adjacent because they have the same vertex, the same point right here, but these are not adjacent because this green angle has its own set of rays and this blue angle has its own set of rays for sides, and the blue angle and the green angle do not have any of the same rays. They don't share a side. So these are not adjacent. However, if we were to put an angle here, we could see that the green angle and the red angle are adjacent because they do share this ray right here, but the green angle and the blue angle are not adjacent. Our next two terms have to do with what the measures of two angles add up to. Angles with degree measures that sum to 90 degrees are called complementary. Whereas angles with degree measures that sum to 180 degrees are called supplementary. Supplementary. So complementary, you can think of adding up to 90 degrees. So if I had a 90-degree angle and I split that with a ray like this, and let's say I had perhaps a 30-degree angle right here and a 60-degree angle, these two angles would be complementary because when summed or added together, they create a 90-degree angle. However, in this example, they're adjacent, but they don't have to be. You could have maybe, I don't know, a 40-degree angle here and a 50-degree angle over here, and 40 plus 50 is 90, so together these two angles are also complementary because they sum to 90 degrees. On the other hand, supplementary angles are angles that sum to 180 degrees. So think about a straight angle. A straight angle is 180 degrees right here. And let's split that into maybe a 120-degree angle and a 60-degree angle. These two angles are supplementary because they add up or sum to 180 degrees. But just like before, they don't have to be adjacent. You could easily have a 100-degree angle and maybe an 80-degree angle right there. And together, these two angles would be supplementary because they add to 180 degrees. Now, it's sometimes hard to tell these apart, complementary and supplementary. So here's two ways that I think about it. One way, the letter C comes before the letter S in the alphabet. Since C comes before S and 90 comes before 180, complementary is 90 degrees and supplementary is 180 degrees. Another way that I like to remember it is this. When you compliment somebody, you're just giving them a good comment. You're saying a nice thing to them, complimenting them. But when you supplement somebody, you're supplementing their income, you're giving them something, a present, or you're giving them money or something like that. I would rather be supplemented than complimented. I'd rather get some money than just be said something nice to. And 180 is greater than 90. So that's how I think of it. Supplementing is better than complimenting. 180 is better than 90. There are two ways to remember it, whichever way you'd like, or just memorize complementary sums to 90 degrees and supplementary sums to 180 degrees. Let's talk about two more words. A pair of opposite rays formed by two intersecting lines. Well, what does they even look like first? So if I have one line here and one line here, the opposite angles would be here and here. Those are called vertical angles. Vertical angles. Okay? And one property we know about vertical angles is that vertical angles are always congruent. So if this was 80 degrees right here, then this angle right here would also be 80 degrees because they're vertical angles. And we'll talk about why that happens a little more in class. This angle here and this angle here are also vertical angles. So for example, this was 100 degrees. This would also be 100 degrees because they are vertical angles. They're across this vertex from each other. So again, one angle, go across the vertex, this point right here, and you get to the other vertical angle that is congruent. Our last word is a pair of adjacent rays formed by one line and a ray. This is a linear pair. Linear pair. And so if I have two lines right here, okay. In the last example, vertical angles were across the vertex from each other. But in a linear pair, these angles are adjacent to each other. So, for example, these two. Now you might notice from before that these two angles in a linear pair will be supplementary. They're going to add up to 180 degrees. So a linear pair always is supplementary and sums to 180. So maybe this is an 80-degree angle, and this would have to be a 100-degree angle. Again, linear pairs are always supplementary. Before we go ahead and talk about missing measurements in sides and angles, I'd like to use these two figures. First, pause the video and see if you can find any adjacent angles in these two figures. The answers will be coming up in 3, 2, 1. There are many angles in these figures that are adjacent, but here are a couple examples. Notice how both examples here share a common ray. That's what it means for two angles to be adjacent. Next, can you find a pair of complementary angles? Pause the video now because the answer will be coming up in 3, 2, 1. Remember, complementary angles sum to 90 degrees, and we can tell these two angles in green sum to 90 because of the symbol right here. These two will add up to 90. Next, can you find a pair of supplementary angles? Here in blue are some examples of supplementary angles. You can notice that they create a straight angle, which is 180 degrees when put together. So you can tell they add up to 180 degrees that way. Next, can you find examples of vertical angles in these diagrams? Pause the video now. The answers will be coming up in 3, 2, 1. And here we have a couple examples of vertical angles. Of course, there are many more, but you can tell that these are vertical angles because they are across the vertex from each other, and they are formed by two intersecting lines. Next up, a linear pair. Can you find an example of a linear pair in these two diagrams? Pause now. The answers are coming up in 3, 2, 1. Here are some examples of linear pairs. Of course, there are many other examples here too. You'll notice that these are the same as the supplementary angles that I highlighted before. That's because since linear pairs have to form a straight angle, they of course have to be supplementary as well. Supplementary doesn't have to be linear pair, but all linear pairs have to be supplementary.